Hello and welcome to my sixth video in the series on political ideas, continuing again with liberalism. And today we're going to look at the different types of liberalism, starting off with classical liberalism, going through modern liberalism, and then onto neoliberalism. Now, this is one of the bits of the course that can be a little bit confusing. So how have we ended up with all these different forms of the same basic ideology? Well, political ideas are complex, and they're often influenced by their context and what is going on in the world at that particular time. So obviously the world of the 17th century, 18th century, 19th centuries, they are changing and developing, and then get into the 20th and 21st, and everything becomes very different once more. And so the ideas have to adapt to those different points in time. And the other thing that happens is that thinkers come along and they look at the world around them and they adapt, reinterpret, and add to the already existing ideas. So liberalism is not a single kind of static set of ideas, and sometimes this can cause a degree of confusion, because sometimes a group of liberals at one point seem to be saying something very, very different to a group of liberals at another. And there are some questions that are raised, such as does modern liberalism completely disregard classical liberalism? And then there are aspects of liberalism which we can ask, well, actually, are these in the right band of ideas at all? There are some aspects that look a bit like socialism. There are some aspects which look very much like conservatism. So we've got lots of these interesting bits to try to delve into in this video. Right, so we're going to start with classicalism and as it started. Now, it's focused really on negative freedom, and that is all negative liberty, and the basis of that is really what we want is we want the ability to do what we want. We are all individuals seek individual freedom, and therefore what we're looking at is an ideal which is the absence of restraint. So there isn't somebody, a state or of some other power that's telling you you can't do that, you can't behave in that way, you can't do the following things. And the classical liberals talks about this kind of life of life, happiness, and all those things that they were worried could be stopped by, and most normally what it could be stopped by was the state. So I got my little man with his front holding up the yes, because yes, that's what classical liberalism is saying. You can do what you want to do. You shouldn't be restrained by anybody. Now, this kind of individualistic policy or set of ideas means that they believe in classical liberalism in a very, very minimal state, and that state is what's referred to as a mechanistic state, and that it is like a machine that is created to serve the people, not to control them. And you'll see this in liberal thought, and this runs all the way through classical liberalism. There's still kind of classical liberals around today, and what they really, really hate is the idea that the state is controlling them rather than they, as the people, have control over the state. And this is where this goes back to these early ideas of a mechanistic state, and this idea of there being a minimal state being small. That's an idea you'll still see very strongly in American politics. Right, they believed in laissez-faire capitalism, and this is the idea that the government doesn't interfere. Nobody interferes in the economy. It is allowed to run its natural course. You have markets, and Adam Smith, who was one of the key early thinkers on this, talks about the invisible hands of the market controlling prices. And essentially he's saying, right, don't interfere in it, don't stick protective tariffs up, don't try and stop the economy functioning as it should, and in which case what you'll get is a really good balance. And therefore people who come up with good ideas and work hard, they should succeed. And so we've got a degree of meritocracy in it. And for those who don't succeed, he talks about this idea of trickle-down economics, where actually economic growth is good for everybody, and the success, even if it's the success of a few, is good for the many, because that money will trickle down, because the people who earn the money will spend the money, they will employ people, and all that. There were also arguments in classical liberalism about equal rights, and they you can look at things like the key rights in the American Bill of Rights and things like that. But the only other bits that we start seeing in terms of equal rights is it is from the liberal school of thoughts that we see the early advocates of women's rights. And Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the early writers on that. And this promotes the idea that liberals believe very much in rationalism, they talk about it's irrational to deny half the population their rights, and about the need for education to make sure that everybody can access those rights, in particular women at this point. Now, classical liberalism is also, at the time, because of when it's created, is seen as kind of something that has revolutionary potential, because it goes against the states as they had traditionally been. So in Europe, we're used to ideas of absolute monarchy, the divine right of kings, and the liberals are saying this is absolutely wrong. This cannot be accepted. And so liberalism could lead to revolution in places where there was absolute monarchy and this idea of divine right, and the people were being ruled without their consent. Think about the French Revolution. Think about the Revolutionary War that the Americans fight against the British to kind of get rid of the tyranny of kings. So it's a radical idea at the time. Might not seem particularly radical in a modern view, but it was a radical ideology. Now, as it starts to develop from its early stages, it's then put into context, because what we start to see is industrialization. So these largely rural, sparsely populated states that were talking about these kind of great ideals, and they were largely being talked about by the property classes. And then suddenly we have industrialization, and we've got this massive change in society. And classical liberalism has to try and adapt to this. Now, John Bentham, who is a key kind of philosopher looking at utilitarianism, he starts to say, well, actually, in an industrial society, this idea of individualism and individual happiness is a more difficult thing to come about. And so what society needs to do is it needs to shift to this idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, to achieve that, a large number of people have to have a say in terms of what's happening. And so this starts to push the idea of democracy. Now, not all liberals, classical liberalists at this point are in favour of universal suffrage or anything like that, but it starts to push this idea of greater and greater democracy. And that's something we see liberal parties in different countries pushing through the 19th century. There are some other kind of key thinkers and ideas at this point, largely in the 19th century. You've got Samuel Smiles, who writes about self-help, not state help, the idea that development of humanity will be stunted if the state steps in and helps people, and that people really should look after and improve their own lot. And if people do that, then they are opening themselves up to much, much greater reward and possibility. And so that is the ideal he put forward. Now, this was then taken to even greater extreme by Herbert Spencer. Now, Herbert Spencer used the ideas of Darwin in the mid-19th century, and he tried to apply this to people. It's often referred to as social Darwinism. And this gave this idea, this very, very individualistic idea of survival of the fittest. And he talks about how kind of this form of extreme individualism at this point would see the removing of the weak, the feeble, the uneducated, and those incapable of looking after themselves. And then you would return to some kind of utopian society where people were embedded with kind of individual freedom and able to look after themselves. So these were kind of almost like Spencer and were kind of doom merchants about society in the mid-19th century, and kind of went, well, how is society going to survive when we've got this massive number of poor and destitute, and who's going to look after them? And his answer to that was, well, they should look after themselves, and if they can't, well, so be it, and society will come out stronger the other end. So there's a lot in that which doesn't sound very liberal, but this was one of the strands in classical liberalism. Probably the most important development towards the end of classical liberalism is John Stuart Mill's ideas, and he started talking about a variety of really important things that come through and feed into liberalism into the more modern age. So the idea of representative democracy. Now, one of the problems they said is a lot of society couldn't make those rational choices that liberals believe people could because they hadn't had the education. They said, well, we don't want those individuals making all the decisions anyway. What we want to do is we want them to select representatives, and then the representatives can make the best judgments in terms of what's best for society as a whole. And we use representative democracy rather than direct democracy, and this is something that you'll have seen in earlier units. Now, he also came up very much with the harm principle, and the idea behind this was that individuals should be allowed to do anything that doesn't cause harm to others. And this is essential kind of a developing of the ideas of individual rights that we go back to right at the beginning of classical liberalism. And he also talks about developmental liberalism, developmental individualism, and this was the idea that what we should look at is what people can become rather than necessarily what they are at this moment in time. And this starts to feed a lot of ideas into modern liberalism to do with equality of opportunity. So this idea from Mill is really positive on this idea that humanity will permanently be improving, that individuals will permanently be improving, and we shouldn't try and put limits on what people can become. The main thing that Mill feared was tyranny of the majority. So his worry is that if you try and kind of put together everyone's freedom and you have ideas like democracy, then what's going to happen is an individual's rights can be eroded by the fact that they don't fit with the views of the majority. And so this is something that why he thought the idea of representatives making rational choices as something that could prevent that tyranny of the majority. So if the majority wants something which is not right and will do more harm than it would do good, then the representatives can say, no, we're not doing that. It's not a good idea. So not quite a kind of really modern ideas of democracy. Right. So if we move on then, so we're going from the classical stage into the medieval stage. Now, there is an argument in here that there's quite a significant clash between these two forms of liberalism. Now, in terms of the basic ideas of liberty, modern liberals talk more about social justice and a kind of idea of positive liberty rather than the negative liberty of classical liberals. Again, it's about individuals achieving things, but it says, well, look, actually, a lot of people fail to achieve their potential because they are restrained by socioeconomic factors, things that are beyond their control. So what we need to do is we need to act on society to try and bring about greater equality of opportunity. Now, a lot of early modern liberalism, they were a little bit vague on exactly how this would happen, but we do start to see, as we get into the 20th century, some really big ideas that start to take hold in terms of the state growing and taking a role in ensuring this equality of opportunity. And what they created is what's known as an enabling state. So this is a state that enables the freedoms of its members of society. And we see this with liberal social reform, starts bringing things like pensions and series of acts to help children. We see it in Keynesian economics, which tries to set up this idea of managed capitalism, where it's not left to run completely free as it would have been under a classical liberal, under the ideas of the likes of Adam Smith, but instead it is managed in such a way to do the greatest good for the greatest number. So, for example, key principle of Keynesian economics is the idea of full employment. Now, we see that really strongly with the New Deal in America under Roosevelt in the 1930s. And it's a really guiding principle of what's known as the post-war consensus in Britain between 1945 and 1979. So we really are seeing a very, very different state to the minimal state of the classical liberals. But again, you could argue it is still all about freedom. And now it's looking at freedom in a slightly different way, but it is still coming back down to individuals and individuals achieving their potential and being free. Now, the next stage, really, in Keynesianism, in terms of beyond Keynesianism, though happening largely at the same time, is stuff that came out of the Beveridge report, and this led to ideas of the welfare state. Again, this is about the idea that there are factors and these giants that Beveridge talks about that are stopping people achieving their potential and eroding equality of opportunity. But it leads to a state on a scale that hadn't been seen before. Now, we start to see things like the NHS in the UK. We see massive welfare programs. We see the massive growth of and improvement of council housing. So all this stuff, the state is taking on a bigger and bigger role. Now, this is probably something that classical liberals would have been very, very uncomfortable with. But in the modern liberals were saying, no, look, this is our role. Now, this goes even further in the 1970s. Arguments from the likes of John Rawls, who starts to talk about redistribution of wealth, and for some in the liberal kind of scheme of thought are going, well, this is too far. So this to me looks like socialism. So not only has we got a big enabling state that's managing equality of opportunity, but we're also starting to see wealth skimmed from those who have it and given away to those who don't. And so this is then seen as a really big change. Now, Rawls and others argue that it's not socialism because they are still just trying to level out things in terms of opportunity. There still will be no equality of outcome, which a socialist would want. So people aren't all going to end up with the same wealth, the same things based on redistribution. It's just going to redistribute to a degree to enable that equality of opportunity. So we've seen there, liberalism has gone from a very, very small state, which basically tries to do as little as possible in classical liberalism, through to in modern liberalism, where the state is stepping in quite significantly, particularly in kind of socio-economic matters and things like welfare. Now, we see further developments in modern liberalism as we continue to the modern day. So real kind of huge thought on constitutional reform, codified constitutions. In the UK, we've seen push on things like reform of the House of Lords, ideas such as devolution, come back to ideas of liberalism. And we also see push in socialism, ideas of tolerance of minorities, things like affirmative action that we've seen across Europe and also in the US, where you get particular groups. And for example, in America, funding on federal schemes can depend on whether there is affirmative action or not. So affirmative action gives essentially extra opportunity to groups who have historically been denied it. And for example, we might see it in British politics with things like all-women shortlists, which the Labour Party have used as of the Liberals. Modern liberals such as Betty Friedan argue that social liberalism continues the old ideas of John Stuart Mill of the no harm rule. So, for example, by bringing in laws against sexual discrimination, then you are preventing harm happening to the opportunities and life chances of women. So there are claims of great consistency, but again, we can see also inconsistency in this. So one of the things that you need to decide is whether you can see that germ cell of an idea, of the liberal ideas, that continues all the way through all these developments, or are actually we getting to the point where modern liberalism conflicts really, really strongly with classical liberalism, and to some extent there's some elements of modern liberalism stretch to the left of the political spectrum and start stepping over towards socialism. Right, now there's another strand of liberalism, the third strand, founded largely by Friedrich von Hayek in the 20th century. Now, neoliberalism, there's lots of arguments about it. It's one that we'll come back to when we look at conservatism, because as you'll see at the bottom of the slide, one of the questions I ask, is it really conservatism? Is it not liberalism at all? Well, it seems to be some kind of form of updated classical liberalism, but then a lot of neoliberals say, no, it isn't. This is something new. This is a new strand. It rejects modern liberalism, and I think that's a really key foundation of it. So it says that things have gone too far. The state is too enlarged. We need to cut it back. No more Beveridge report. No more welfare state. No more Keynesian economics. No more redistribution of wealth as put forward by Rawls. What we need is people free from the state. I can see I got a missing F there. So people free from the state, and we need to have a huge reduction in public spending, peel all that back. And again, the state needs to stop. You might hear the saying from neoliberals, we should get rid of the nanny state. We need to stop the state telling people how to do things. We need to let people do things how they want to do. Now, it depends where you go with neoliberals. There are some neoliberals who still are really kind of liberal in terms of social policy as well as economic policy, but often you'll find a mixture where someone is a neoliberal economically and wants a small state and all the rest of it, and then also promotes really kind of conservative social values. So in that point, we get into a bit of incoherence in a lot of the neoliberal world, where you've got people who are neoliberals in one way, but conservatives in others. And that then leads us to this issue: is neoliberalism a strand of liberalism, or is it a strand of conservatism? And that is quite difficult. It does seem to have a lot in common with classical liberalism, but in terms of ideas on social policy, it varies very much within the neoliberal group. Right, thank you very much. Don't forget to like, to comment, to subscribe. There'll be polls and things on here. There should be a little eye that appears in the top right-hand corner at various points during the video. Click on that, do the polls, and interact with the video. Thank you very much for watching. I shall speak to you all again soon.